Incoming message.
Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're putting on our investigative journalist hats and we're diving into a really high-stakes, data-driven geographic mystery. We're looking at the map of the world, but not the one you had in your high school geography class, right? We're looking at the restricted map. You know the mythology around cryptids, these legendary, elusive creatures? It always treats them as if they're just impossible to find, impossibly rare. But what if we've been looking at this entirely the wrong way? What if they aren't rare at all? What if actually they're just living in the exact places we've been explicitly told not to go? So let's examine the geography of myths and expose the global politics of restricted exploration.
It's kind of a wild thought, isn't it? What if we simply agreed not to find them? See, we usually assume that, well, because we have satellites mapping literally every square inch of the globe and we've got submarines diving into the abyss, any massive biological creature would absolutely have been officially cataloged by now. The core assumption is basically, hey, if we haven't officially documented it, it has to be a myth. But I want to throw a totally different premise at you right now. What if our failure to find these creatures isn't actually a lack of scientific capability, but a deliberate, systematic avoidance of their habitats?
Okay, let's dive right into this. 5. That is the number of brand new species, on average, that scientists discover every single day. Just let that sink in for a second. 5 new creatures every single day. They were always there, we just hadn't looked in the right place yet. This completely shatters the idea that our modern world is just, fully explored and out of biological surprises. We clearly have the tech, the funding, and the scientific apparatus to find new life. So our inability to officially document famous cryptids, it's not because we lack the tools. It's because we aren't pointing those tools in the right direction.
And that brings us to the whole central thesis of our investigation in this explainer. We aren't missing these creatures. We're actively avoiding them. As you look at the data, a really specific, undeniable pattern starts to emerge. Human beings are being actively steered away from cryptid territories through official restrictions, ancient customs, and massive bureaucratic barriers. We aren't failing to find them, we're literally being legally or culturally blocked from walking into their living rooms. Act 1. Sacred Lands and Sasquatch. Okay, let's test this theory out in the sprawling forests of North America. Check out the geographic correlation here. When you actually plot modern Bigfoot sightings on a map, they cluster super heavily in very specific regions. Most notably, we're talking the Pacific Northwest and the Sierra Nevada. But here's where it gets crazy. If you take that modern map and overlay it with historical geographic data, those exact sighting clusters map perfectly onto areas designated by indigenous peoples as sacred sites. These were strictly off-limit zones. They represent areas of explicit historical avoidance. Think about it. For 15,000 years, indigenous peoples lived on this continent without discovering Bigfoot in the modern sense. Why? Because they already knew it was there and they literally mapped their society around it. And this brilliantly illustrates a huge clash of approaches. On one side, you've got indigenous coexistence, right? They utilized these behavioral avoidance protocols. They designated certain valleys or really deep woods as restricted sacred land, which effectively created this incredible buffer zone that maintained a biological balance. But then on the flip side, you have settler expansion. When white settlers arrived, they basically just ignored those ancient geographical boundaries. They engaged in systematic exploration, pushing right into those previously restricted zones. And suddenly, boom, the creature that had been coexisted with for millennia becomes this huge mystery. The Sasquatch always existed in those territories. The mystery really only started when human expansion breached those ancient agreed-upon borders.
Act 2. The Deep Sea Cover-Up.
Now, if you think land borders are strictly enforced, just wait until we look at the politics of the ocean floor.
Let's look at some navigation logs and this chronological deep sea pattern, because it's fascinating. Back in the 1990s, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, classified certain deep ocean zones as not currently navigable or just entirely restricted from commercial traffic. Human access was shut down. Then we jump forward to 2004. Huge biological breakthrough. The very first live giant squid is finally photographed in its natural habitat. But guess where it was found? Yep, in the exact zones previously classified as restricted or too dangerous to explore. We announced it to the world as this grand discovery, but the real realization today is that the squid wasn't new. It was literally always there. We just finally slipped past the bureaucratic red tape and actually entered its territory. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast. The official explanation for keeping commercial traffic and independent subs out of these zones, they cited dangerous currents and unexpected geological activity. It was framed purely as a navigational hazard. But the biological reality?
these restricted zones functioned perfectly as the undisturbed natural habitat of the giant squid. The official safety warnings basically acted as an ironclad barrier, protecting the squid's natural territory from any sort of commercial disruption. Which honestly forces us, as investigators, to ask a pretty tough question. Why were those ocean zones actually restricted in the first place? Like, who looked at the sonar data and decided, yep, totally off limits? Do these safety warnings actually function as a deliberate cover for sensitive biological research? Or are they genuinely just hazards that, just so happen to perfectly harbor undiscovered marine life? When commercial exclusion zones correlate flawlessly with the discovery of massive deep-sea creatures, we really have to question the true motives behind the map.
Moving right along to Act 3, sonar mapping the loch. So let's shift our geographic focus over to Scotland to look at some highly localized, instrument-based evidence.
So, the crucial point here is really the sonar data. The actual reality of Loch Ness is entirely different from what you see in the tourist brochures. This body of water has been extensively sonar scanned and studied. And what that deep-sea sonar mapping reveals is honestly incredible. Vast, completely unexplored underground cave systems branching right off from the main loch. But here's where the pattern repeats itself. Exploration of these mapped caves is consistently halted. And why? Official danger warnings and completely prohibitive economic costs. We know for a fact the caves are there, and the monster sightings correlate perfectly with these mapped but unentered biological hideouts. It really seems like economic costs and safety warnings are actively suppressing investigations into the exact habitats where a large creature could, realistically, survive completely undetected.
Act 4, the exclusion zone overlay. Let's pull back for a macro-level view of the past 150 years of data.
And this brilliantly illustrates the undeniable global pattern. Just look at this. If you take 150 years of recurring sighting reports and overlay them with a map of restricted human access, the results are pretty staggering. Bigfoot in North America maps directly to indigenous sacred land. The giant squid in the deep ocean maps to NOA navigation hazards and commercial exclusion zones. And the Loch Ness Monster in Scotland, that maps perfectly to officially warned off unexplored cave systems. You see, it doesn't even matter what the political stripe of the government is or what era we're in. Across the board, classified military areas, commercial exclusion zones, and sacred sites basically act as massive, heavily guarded wildlife preserves. It really all boils down to this quote right here. Creatures exist in places humans have agreed through law, custom, or fear not to go. These legendary animals, they aren't hidden by magic or something supernatural. They are hidden by human barricades. We have literally fenced ourselves out of their habitats.
Finally, conclusion. Who guards the map? As we wrap up this explainer, we absolutely have to face the geopolitical implications of all this. The world is just not as fully mapped and openly accessible as we've been led to believe. Ultimately, cryptids aren't mysteries because they're impossible to find. They're mysteries because we've built a world that actively avoids finding them. The real question isn't whether unknown life exists on this planet. The real question is, who decided they shouldn't be found? Like, who really holds the true map of the restricted zones? And what happens when someone finally decides to ignore the warnings, bypass the barricades, and just take a look? Keep questioning the map, folks. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.
Come to me, chickens! Cock-a-doodle-doo!